Good morning. I'm on the seafront here in Plymouth Hoe. It's actually a lovely morning. It was going to rain, but the rain's moved away at the moment, and we've just got a fantastic early morning light over Plymouth Sound. And it's an unusual day because there's several warships here in Plymouth, and that's become a very rare sight, but that's another story. The other interesting thing about today is we've got the BBC filming around us. Apparently they've come to film a statue. We're here for something rather more important, and I'm joined today by Jason Barnett. Jason, welcome. You've come a long way. Where have you come from?
I've come from Leeds in West Yorkshire.
Okay, that was a long coach journey.
About 9 hours, but it was comfortable.
Right, 9 hours from Leeds to Plymouth, and you've come to talk to the UK column. Why have you come?
I've worked with children across the UK for over 25 years. There's a hidden issue within the UK. Our job is to keep children safe and to make sure children are cared for. And that's not happening in many institutions, and certainly not in some of the schools. We have a big issue with bullying, violence, including sexual violence in schools, and that's been hidden, and it's something I've tried to expose through a campaign over the last 7 years. Now, that's been touched upon by the mainstream media on a number of occasions, but today we're here to tell the whole story. It's something that the UK public needs to know about. We can't deal with a problem unless we know about that problem, and so that's what today's about.
Right, excellent. Well, there's only one thing to do. Shall we go to the studio? So good afternoon and welcome to Dispatches, and I'm back in the UK column studio with Jason Barnett. And it was only a couple of hours ago actually that Jason and I were stood on the waterfront at Plymouth. We decided to go down to get that shot with a bit of the nicer parts of Plymouth there, looking over Plymouth Sound, but to get a backdrop to talk about a really serious subject, which is what's happening to children in schools, children being bullied, badly abused, and this leading to tragic circumstances of suicide in some cases. So, Jason, it's nice to have you actually in the UK column studio. We've got about 45 minutes in which we're going to try and really get into your story. And I've got to say that I have been astonished at how much work that you've been able to achieve since about 2014, I think it was, when you first got going.
Yeah.
So you have stood up, you've spoken to parents, you've brought people together, you've arranged meetings, you have written to every single MP, you have spoken to the press, you've spoken to the major media companies, the BBC, ITV, Sky News. You have done so much in those years for this cause, but I'm going to say you're a bit of an unlikely character to do this because you've got a background in weightlifting. You were a lightweight,
but world natural lightweight bodybuilding champion, and I've captained the British team, and then multiple British and UK champion.
Right. So that in itself is a pretty amazing achievement. But here you are with this tremendous switch in a way from your focus to the children. Now, I believe that your story started in a special school. You were working as a teacher in a special school.
Yeah.
And in that special school, you started to discover that things weren't right and that children were being badly bullied. Just as a little snapshot, tell us what was happening.
So I, as an unqualified teacher and support in that school, it was just an all-round level of violence within the school. So not specifically just bullying, but levels of violence. So we had incidents, and they were numbering, where we had the police coming in to deal with incidents 2 to 3 times a week. There were times when we're taking children to hospital to have injuries dealt with. And so it got to a point where we should be recording all the incidents, and as fast as you're trying to record those incidents, it's like fighting fire. So at the end of the day, you'd get to the end of the day and there'd be incidents that you didn't even know about because there was so much going on in that school. So from there, I'd recorded a lot of those incidents and was able to carry that evidence and have that to carry onwards.
Okay, so just some basic things. We're not going to name the school, but how many pupils will be at that school? How many?
So this was a small specialist school, so we'd have around 20 to 28 within the school.
And these were children with all pretty challenging educational needs.
Sometimes behavioural, but we had children with autism, so different types of disabilities. So
Yeah.
it was a mix with children that didn't fit into the normal mould in every school. So no, some of the children would have autism, like I say, different disabilities. So there was a range from children with behavioural challenges and right across that board. So yeah, lots of different needs within the school.
Lots of different needs. And the school being run by a private company.
Yeah.
Right, okay. And so something happens and you speak out about it. Can you tell us what was the actual day that triggered you deciding to speak out about what was happening?
So I wouldn't say there was a specific day, because from the start of a new management team coming in and that company coming in, I was already there. So
Yeah.
I'm already outlaying some of the problems and issues that we have. So it was over a period of 8 months that the children are getting hurt. I'm speaking out about the problems almost as a representative within those meetings, and we're seeing the same mistakes being made over and over again, with action being called for to say, hey, we can't keep making these same mistakes. And you're seeing the right response isn't coming to the point where I say, if you're not going to do something from within the organisation, I'm going to hold you accountable as a management team or as a head teacher, certainly, and I'm going to take this outside the organisation.
Right.
That led to me ultimately resigning in 2015, which is probably 7 months after that 8-month period. So going through a process and eventually deciding that the only way I can protect the children is to take the issue outside of the school and reach out to those agencies and those people in charge and the MPs and the media from outside the organisation and
Okay.
outside that control.
Now that's
really.
a pretty big step, because effectively you resigned from a paid job, and your what's the word? Your passion then was already, you had to do something about it. So you resign. Who'd you go to for help?
So, as someone who's been in education for over 20 years, your first stop obviously is Ofsted or the Department for Education, but certainly Ofsted, your area Ofsted do inspections, they make sure the children are safe. So that's my first stop, to be told that they don't have the remit to get involved in individual cases. So it will be passed on to the Department for Education, and they will potentially look at that and decide whether there's going to be an emergency inspection. But after doing that, that initially doesn't happen at that first stage.
Right, so you don't actually get a response that somebody says, well, Mr. Barnett, you need to come in and talk to us.
No response back, no queries, no questions, no elaboration on any of the issues or the complaints or concerns that I've raised.
It's, well, I'm going to say in some ways it's astonishing, but I know in lots of ways it's not. And as we're going to hear as this thing unfolds, that the walls keep coming up. So you've resigned, you're trying to go to the right authorities to get a result, and you're also taking a case through a tribunal process. Just tell us about that. What happens in that tribunal process and what's the outcome?
Yeah, so part of the tribunal process was my union had said they couldn't support me in that. Against a company of this size, there was no way I could win. But what I was adamant I wanted to do was get what I was saying had happened evidenced and on public record. The story was quite extraordinary. And I realised that on public record it would drag the attention towards the children, towards the story. So the process is to go through an employment tribunal first and clear quite a few hurdles, basically to say that the school, what I say is happening within the school is happening. So the children are in danger, there are lots of incidents, the police are involved. I've then got to try and prove that I suffered bad treatment because of that. I've then got to prove that it was directly because of that I was punished badly, and then I've got to prove that I had to leave because of that.
Right, okay.
So it's a long process that went on over 2 years with appeals to an application to the Court of Appeal, and initially they tried to have that thrown out, well, immediately before it even got to court, which was basically, this is all made up, none of it stands up, it shouldn't even get to court. And bear in mind, this is a company with 16 witnesses and I have nobody, but it obviously made it through court to an appeal stage for a judge to say everything this guy's saying that happened as fact is fact. He has suffered potentially bad treatments, but what we can't say for certain is, looking into the minds of his employer, is that they treated him badly because of what he was saying was happening in the school. And I was always warned that whistleblowing cases are very difficult to win, almost impossible. So I couldn't get any solicitors to take that on and had to go through that 10-day process on my own. But essentially I got what I needed, which was that everything was put down on paper to say these children need help, this case needs looking at.
And you deliberately put down a lot of detail on your statement, which was in excess of what you would have required simply for the tribunal, in order to get that as a factual record as to what was taking place, what had taken place at the school?
My statement was 50 pages long,
Right.
and essentially it documented everything that I'd recorded or that I knew of over the year. I needed a complete picture of everything that was happening in the school. So whether I won or lost that case, somebody would be able to take a look at that public record, see the full picture, and say this school needs looking at and these children need protecting.
Right. So a school where particularly vulnerable children were being abused, bullied, abused, and you take the right action, you're forced to resign, you go through a tribunal process where you get some result because you've got the evidence down on official paperwork, but none of the authorities have engaged with you. Now, the tribunal judge, I think, said to you, well, you've given me more than I can deal with in this court. I'm only here as a judge to deal with your tribunal issue.
Yeah.
Now, we can understand that in a informal language. The judge has said that's the case. But of course, as a man, what the judge was saying, well, the children have been abused, but I can't do anything about it. The Department for Education was rejecting you. Ofsted was rejecting you. And the police, what about the police? Did they engage at all?
Yeah, so initially, and just to point out, when I say abuse, it was violence peer on peer. So my complaint was not having the resources and the staffing meant that these kids that needed the support and the help were able to, there was too much aggression between the children. So it wasn't any adult on child abuse. The police had been to a lot of those incidents. And when I left, I said, it's not about just me speaking out and blowing the whistle. I need some of your input and your support and the credibility that you have. You've been there, you've seen what's happened, you've witnessed it. Can you support the statements that are going forwards? There was a report that came back that said this is a child protection issue. It's not our department, not from a specific officer, but from that department, but that they weren't going to get involved in what they said was a personal issue of mine.
Yeah, right. Okay, so the tribunal finishes.
Yeah.
And what do you do then? What was the bridge between your personal case and then the fact that you were later to be involved with about 120, maybe more parents? How did that occur?
Okay, so from that tribunal, you've got the evidence there. That then goes, Ofsted have not looked at it and the DfE have said they've done their job. So now you want to check if the job they've done corresponds with the seriousness of the case that's been documented on file and now publicly available. So you send that to the Prime Minister, Theresa May at the time, the opposition leader, Jeremy Corbyn, the Shadow Education Secretary, Angela Rayner, and the Education Secretary. The Education Secretary says that that would have been investigated and so the case is closed. So then you've got a period of a couple of years where you're trying to get people to look at that. As you say, the Children's Commissioner, the charities, you go through the process, and that's over 4 years then from the start to 2018 December for someone within Ofsted to say, we've never ever looked at this case. You did send the complaints in, we can confirm that, but it hasn't been investigated because it's been lost on our system somewhere. Right,
but just take you back there. You were saying that from authority in Parliament, the system, they were saying, oh, that would have been investigated. Who actually said casually it would have been investigated?
So that was an official on behalf of Justine Greening. So the letter went to her office, an official applied on her behalf from the Department for Education.
Right. So we're seeing some of the arrogance here, aren't we? I'm deliberately using my hand to brush you away because, whatever your complaint is or your query, don't bother us because this would have been investigated.
Yeah, because my first instinct or the concerns I had in my mind at that point was either if it has been investigated, what I've just repeated and I'd sent them all the assault records and the court documents should have brought you to such alarm that you go and check.
Right.
So either you check because it's the most alarming, shocking thing you've ever heard, or you do brush it off because you hear this all the time and it's no big deal. And either of those means we've got a problem within this country. So at that point, that's when I'm reaching out to the opposition, to the Labour Party, with an official complaint to say, it's clear that there's an issue. It's clear that there's a problem in the system when this isn't being taken seriously.
Right.
As the opposition, your job is to hold them to account. Nobody else is doing it. Can we do that? And the response is, there's a system that protects every child in this country. You're working through that system. It ends with the Department for Education. That's the only option you have. And my response is, well, what happens when they fall down and they don't deal with it? and there isn't an answer at that point.
Right.
And it's only then when we get to Ofsted after 4 years that they say, well, the system that everybody's telling you should rely on and that keeps every child safe in this country has failed in this case.
Yeah.
And as I say, I then reach out to every MP in the country, 500 English MPs at the time, in January 2019, send them the letter to say the system's fallen down. It has the potential to affect every child in the country. Let's all get together and look at this. I would like a meeting with the Education Secretary and the Shadow. And those, again, are brushed away and rejected. And it runs right through to June, where I keep appealing maybe 3 or 4 times to every MP that children are going to be hurt. There's evidence now coming forward to me that children are being hurt, to the point where it reaches out. I have a meeting with Angela Brenner. It's a chance meeting at an event. I speak to her. She confirms, which we can see on a video, that there are issues with the system.
We're talking about the deputy leader of the Labour Party here.
Now deputy leader, at the time the Shadow Education Secretary. So, you know, she confirms and agrees with me that, you know, there may be problems in this system, but there is really not a fix for it at the moment. I then come away from that meeting and that's all I'm left with. The system is potentially broken, but nobody can do anything at this time.
Yeah.
That's when I then reach out to families, looking through newspaper articles and finding the families that have had issues with bullying and violence in school, and finding a pattern, reaching out with this video and saying, hey, this is my story. This is what happens to the children in my situation and what I fear is happening to children all over the UK. Can you tell me what happened in your case? And that's when the pattern came, that this is exactly what happened to us.
So you had started to see the newspaper articles, or they were becoming very raw to you, because
I'd say that was a more better description. It was just becoming apparent.
So you read yet another case of a child being bullied at school, or a case of a child committing suicide as a result of bullying at school, and you worked to see whether you could get in contact with those parents.
Yeah.
And then it started to pour out of the system, because more and more of these families contacted you, and you were more successful at contacting families yourself. So that number that I mentioned earlier of about 120 families, is that about the right number for the ones you were
Those are the
with?
ones, again, so I'd reached out to all these families, but it was just, your antenna goes on, and then you see all these stories, you see it in everything, and they're quite common. The bullying stories in the press and the consequences. So it would have been 120 I reached. Sadly, 20 families in our group have lost children, but I would say there was double that amount that understandably didn't want to get involved in a campaign and bring up all that pain. So these were the 20 brave families that were able to kind of bring up that strength to do that, but there are so many more. And again, as just one person with no resources and no connections, to be able to get that many families coming forward with those stories, I dread to think that's what's around the rest of the UK, because there's no way I could have reached that.
The numbers of incidents taking place with these children. One of the things we're going to touch on in a minute is the fact that actually there's no records of what's going on. So you start to really discover the scale by the fact what's being reported in the paper, and you're connecting these people, and the thing is beginning to grow and grow. Now, we've got a little video clip here, which is of one of the mothers, a lady called Julie Stewart, who's spoken out with you. She's attended some of the meetings, which we will talk about. But this is a little video clip that you made. I've watched it a couple of times. It's extremely poignant, and we're going to run that for the viewers, and we'll comment on that in a couple of seconds.
My name is Julie Stewart, and I lost my son Simon to suicide in 2014 at just the age of 15, which was a consequence of school bullying and the failure of the authorities and the school to listen to me and to address my complaints and concerns with regards to the bullying that he was experiencing. So I'm now part of the Safer Schools campaign, where parents and families across the UK have come together to voice concerns publicly. Many of those parents are parents who have lost children as well, and there's far too many that are happening each year. As a result, they've all been failed by safeguarding issues that are in place, and this government really needs to look at what is currently happening in this arena. So I'm asking that ministers and MPs would come and accept our invitation, making it a priority to attend the meeting at Leeds Town Hall on October the 25th, to hear the views of the people concerned on what needs to be done to better protect everyone's children right across the United Kingdom, and definitely to prevent this from ever happening to any family ever again.
So you watch that video and, well, what can you say? What can you say to a parent who's lost a child like that? An amazing lady.
And I'd just like to point out that that video was sent personally to 20 ministers and MPs. So the leaders of each party, the education ministers, the whole of the Education Select Committee, an appeal for them to come to that meeting, and nobody attended in Leeds.
Right, okay. We've got two meetings to talk about. Just to stay on the families.
Yeah.
You've learned from working with the families now for several years that, of course, they come under immense pressure the moment these incidents happen, because there's the trauma of what's happened to their child.
Yeah.
The child has been suffered as a result of severe bullying. If the child has then gone on to commit suicide, of course, that is an immense trauma for the family. They've got to deal with that trauma, and they then come up against a system which maybe in the early days they just perceive as being rather unhelpful. They go for help at the school, they don't get help from the school. Some of them have tried to go for their MPs, they don't get help from the MPs. But then there's an undertone which gets a little bit more sinister, because you've mentioned that some of the parents have suggested that when they tried to press their cases as to what did actually take place, why the right precautions weren't taken, that they were actually accused of being very angry, or vexatious is a word that's used quite a lot. But the spin was put back that almost, well, the parents are partly to blame for what's happened. Would that be a correct?
Yeah, just one thing to point out is it's probably been a year now, so it seems like we've known the families forever, but it's a year that we've sort of really started getting together. But yeah, those parents are in a very vulnerable state, very tired and exhausted by this system, and to have that turned around you, because they already lose a lot of their support systems. It's a very difficult area when somebody's suffering grief from a tragedy, and every death is tragic, but when it's from an illness or something that's foreseeable, you know, sometimes friends and family can cope with being around and supporting that. When it's something as tragic as a child losing their life to suicide, and it may be that people are at fault, you know, people don't know how to deal with that, and you get a lot of withdrawal, and people almost a cognitive dissonance of, we don't want that to be true, that there's more to this story than, you know, it not being a tragic accident, and people could have done better. So instead of people rallying around and supporting those stories, they're kind of left to, we don't know how to deal with this. And so that's very trying, very, just very, very difficult. So I found that I was approaching broken families that had just had enough, didn't have the strength to fight. And it's my perception and some of the families' perception, but they feel the system and people within the system know that brokenness and know we're not going to get any fight out of these families. It's not something we have to deal with because nobody's got the strength to fight us. And I feel that's where they had an issue with me, that I was coming to support without having to deal with that grief and with the strength to be able to take on the system. And that seems to me it's always been an issue from the start.
We're going to discuss this aspect in a bit more detail in a minute. But what you're essentially saying is that you took a lead out of your concern from what was happening. You took a lead against the system. So you're dealing with MPs, you're challenging senior civil servants. And then you can sense that there's some backlash because you don't fit the mould. You're not a broken parent. You're a single guy standing up for what you believe to be right. And clearly this is unsettling people in the establishment. And actually, you've been kind enough to explain to me that some things happened later which indicated that you became a bit of a marked man.
Yep.
For the simple reason that you were standing up for these families. So we've got people who are essentially victims of circumstance.
Yeah.
They've gone through awful family trauma. You would expect organisations, you would expect local MPs to be effectively comforting and concerned for these people, but we're seeing something very different. We're seeing walls go up.
Yeah.
We're seeing a refusal to engage. Would it be true to say we're also seeing callousness by some of these officials?
It's difficult to say what they're thinking and what goes through their minds, because I've asked that question a lot of times, and where my personal story comes from is seeing the pain that these children go through. And so I think I'd always started this story with, I go to the cavalry, I do my bit, and they'll come in, the professionals will take over, the experts. And at each stage when people turn away, the question in my mind is, how do you turn away from this? You know, children are going to lose their lives. So you have to say there's got to be a little bit of callousness somewhere in there, because how do you turn away from these situations? That's the part I still don't understand. I understand fear, I understand a lot of things, but I don't understand somebody not doing something.
Not engaging in a sense that a normal, concerned human being would want to get involved.
Yeah.
So you meet the parents, the numbers are going up, the cases are very serious because, of course, a significant proportion of these are to do with the suicides of young children. And one of the things that you go for is a meeting in Leeds.
Yeah.
Tell us about that meeting and tell us about the response you got from officials that you tried to get there.
So we just watched Julie's video, and she'd invited those MPs, and the responses, Paul, we had probably 5 emails out of the 20 responses. I've mentioned who was invited. There were no more than a line or 2.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, I can't make it, there's something else on. There was not a question and not a concern, we need to look at this issue another time, can we get in touch? It was, again, as you say, it seems to be just brushed off. So that meeting went off with the families telling their stories.
How many families were at the Leeds meeting?
There weren't many at that meeting. There weren't many at that initial meeting. I think they'd already had in mind that the MPs don't take these things seriously. That was kind of the call, that we've fought this for years and years. Our families are reticent about us getting involved again. And so that was a quiet meeting. But the point was, these families had travelled from across the country to Leeds.
Right.
You know, it should be the other way around, and they're travelling from as far away as Wales to travel to help the situation. As I always say, some of the families that have lost children have nothing to gain now except to protect other children in the UK. Yeah. So when they're dragging up that grief and that pain and trailing across the country to then be hit with another hammer blow of, we don't have the time to speak to you. Yeah. That's hard, and that's hard to manage with the families, and hard to ask them to keep coming back and keep fighting, but they do. Right.
So just to get that clear in my own mind, so was there anybody of official status at Leeds, or was it just the families?
No, nobody turned up, just the families.
Nobody turns up. And how did the families respond to that?
Leeds, the initial reaction was, sadly, it's what they've come to expect of officials. They are very seasoned in this area. The promise I've made is that we will fight and we'll never give up. But they know it's going to be a long battle, because, you know, as you say, when you've lost a child, you expect the politicians and the MPs to be there to comfort. Yeah. And when none of that happens, you realise that this system is a lot more sinister than what you'd expect. And so every single one of our families, even those who've not lost children, has said, you expect there to be a system in place to protect every child in the country, but it's only when you go through it you realise it's a facade, that these things in place, that Ofsted's, the children's commissioners, none of them have any teeth, none of them have any power, and sadly you have to go through that system and really need their help to realise that none of it works, none of it works. Yeah.
So you continue, and then you go for the big one, which is a meeting at Westminster.
Yeah, we have a general election.
Right.
General election is always a good time to get an MP's attention. So we send letters out just before the general election in December, say, hey, you missed this meeting. we need you to be at the next, we need another one, and we get good responses. A lot saying, if I'm re-elected, I will be at the meeting, I promise.
I smile as you tell me this, yeah.
And so that was arranged from December, the initial arrangement.
Now we're talking, it was February this year actually that Westminster took place.
Yeah, so that was arranged December 2019.
Right, okay. So you wrote to every single MP, I believe, inviting them for that meeting.
Yeah, so at this point, originally I'd been writing to 500 English MPs.
Right.
With reaching the families were coming from Wales, Scotland and that, so it was the same issue, and even though I wasn't sure exactly what their policies were, it was the same issue in every country. And so it was an open invite to every single MP that was in Parliament.
Right. And out of those, you got how many responses, do you think?
I would say over the period of about a month, we probably got 80 responses,
Right.
80 responses from those. Probably 10 or so said they were definitely coming. There were lots of inquiries about what the time was, that they tried to make it. They'd look in their diaries. It was a long way ahead, and so they'd look at that when it got closer to the date.
Okay.
And then there were those that couldn't make it.
Right. Now, we're going to talk about some things to do with the media in a more focused way. But actually, the media turned out to be quite important in how this Westminster, to be quite important in the response that you got to the Westminster meeting, in that MPs suddenly got a lot more animated when they believed that Sky News was going to be there.
I would always say the key in my issue, and again, going right through to the Employment Tribunal, was if it's public, it will draw attention, the children's story has to be told. And throughout that period, reaching out to the mainstream media, so The Guardian, The Times, Sky News over and over again, BBC News, relentless, constant letters to these guys saying, hey, there's a story here, the children are in danger, children are being harmed. And going right up to that point, I don't feel we were taken seriously as a campaign because the media weren't playing their part. Yeah. The media's job is to hold those in power to account. And so when the media's not playing their part, those in power have the freedom to do what they like.
Right.
And so that was the issue with our campaign.
Right.
You've got...
But you did get an MP who initially agreed to sponsor a room for you in Westminster. So you got a venue.
Yeah, we had the MP, he'd lost... a sad story, but he'd lost 3 children in his constituency from one school in 1 year, with no investigation from Ofsted, nobody looking into those issues. Simply
lost as in died?
Yeah.
As a result of bullying and...
Bullying, yeah. 2 suicides were families that were in our group,
right,
that had reached out to this MP before.
Right.
And then one of the boys was a boy from a care home, so I don't know if anybody looked into this case.
We can understand that because this had happened on his patch, in his constituency, this MP at least showed some motivation, and he agreed to sponsor a room for you to meet in Westminster. But he was later to pull out. Yeah,
the idea was I'd looked into whether you could have a meeting there and lobby there. Yeah. I was told you wouldn't need a sponsor, so he was particularly targeted. Having lost those 3 children, one of the families had already written to him and had a meeting agreed in 2016, and that never happened. So we decided he was our target, he or the families. And so he was kind of cajoled into that meeting, and agreed to that. And once he'd agreed to it, we then said to every other MP who'd agreed to meetings across the country, we'll bring you all together. So it's public, it's transparent, and all the families can come together as one campaign, and we can basically thrash this out and come up with the solutions, and you can look at the solutions that we have to present to...
Yeah, you're bringing people together, and you're talking about a campaign, but this was not a shouting campaign. This was about bringing people together, sharing information, giving mutual support, and saying, if we're all telling the same story, obviously we've got a powerful story to tell, and the MPs are going to be obliged to take us seriously and do something about it.
Yep. I think the most powerful thing about that is that we'd not come with just the problem. We've come with solutions. I've spoken to people at the head of the suicide prevention, the university, so the professors about suicide prevention. We'd looked at all the issues. We'd spoken to individual MPs and said, hey, your solutions make sense. So across the country, everybody's saying, and the BBC had filmed that these make sense. So we were essentially saying, hey, come to this meeting. We think we can solve this problem.
Yeah.
And so that was the shock that it was presented, those policies were presented, that it was a case of come and hear the evidence and you can go away and probably solve this. So that's where we were at with that.
Yeah,
with
I
that
don't like the
meeting.
expression, but you were being proactive because you were offering a solution to them. It wasn't just you were forcing them into a corner. You were saying to those MPs, come and hear the problem, but this is a possible solution that you've got for rectifying the situation.
Yeah, very significantly, people will always say, and we have this conversation a lot, you've always had bullying, it's always going to go on, I was bullied at school, there is no solution to the problem, otherwise it would have been done by now. Now, what we'd found was going back into Parliament transcripts was there was an issue of the problem not being recorded. So this was discussed in 1990, in 2003, in Parliament 2007, 2016. So at each stage, you've got politicians saying, the problem is we're not recording, so we've no idea of the extent of the problem. You know, if we were to record, that would help solve the problem because we can then deal with it. So each time someone's putting forward the solution and then it's not getting implemented. So we were essentially coming to say, hey, you knew about this in 1990. You said there's a solution. For some reason, it's not being implemented. And in that period, the statistics are saying, we don't know how many to do with bullying, but 200 children are dying a year, potentially because that policy has not been implemented that you know might fix things. So now we've come to the stage where here are the families. Do you need any more evidence than this?
Right.
So there's been mistakes made in the past, but we need to look past that. We just want the solution now.
Right, so you are quite rightly, it's back to stressing the problem, the number of children involved. And by bullying, we're not talking children teasing each other, we're talking about children engaged in pretty brutal physical assault.
Yeah, I'd say to the point where I was collecting evidence of the families, and some families would come forward and say, hey, you know, we've dealt with this incident. And I almost had to say, your case isn't serious enough for us to take forward to Parliament, because people will say, resilience, the child will get over that. That's not that bad. I know it sounds harsh. I know it sounds harsh to say, but our 120 cases had to be so horrendous that you'd be able to stick in front of an MP and say, for example, an autistic boy that had his head stamped on by 5 boys at school went to hospital and it was brushed off.
Yeah.
You know, the lad was blamed for being obnoxious a few days before, which led to him getting his head stamped on. So these are the levels. So when we use that word bullying, you'd more say it's violence and serious assault that people would end up in prison for on the street. And we're not advocating that any children are criminalised, but what we're saying is there's serious violence going on in schools that's leading up to deaths. And there's no way as a public would allow this to go on in society. And the only reason it's going on is because it's behind closed doors, and because it's as bad as it is, nobody wants to record it.
And it's not being recorded, right? Yeah. So back on the meeting, okay, you're set up for this, what is going to be a major event in Westminster. You've got interest from the media, Sky News in particular, but also ITN, I think, was also involved.
ITN.
But then it goes a bit wobbly because your sponsor pulls out and you lose the room. What happens then?
So our first press engagement was with the Yorkshire Post and Birmingham Live, who printed the story. So they're the first ones who've taken the evidence, checked it all out, checked that the government policies, you know, potentially are harming the children, and they put that to the Department for Education, these allegations from us. And it's based off those responses that press story went out, and the day after the Department for Education cancelled, said they couldn't make the meeting. At that point, the sponsor then sent me an email saying, I have to cancel the room. You need to find another venue. I'd asked, well, you know, we only need one MP to be there. And there are others coming. Could you do us a favour and find one of the other 650 MPs in the House to simply put their name down? And he responds to say that's not his job to do. I'd have to.
So this is the brush off again. This is the brush off, right? But somebody did step forward.
Yeah, we had an MP, Sam Tarry, who stepped forward and said, you know, that room's now gone because that MP's let it go. He'd not held on to it for someone else to take the place of that. So we were then relegated from a room which would have fit 160 to a room that would have fit, I think, around 20 to 40. Yeah. And at this point, I speak to the families and I said, well, what's to stop them cancelling the room altogether when we turn up on the day? So we put again a plan together in our private group to have a venue in Parliament that we would pay for ourselves. And we did do some funding, and we basically booked a venue which would stand as a second venue and inform the MPs that, hey, You had the option of one meeting to start with, which some of you are coming to. We're now giving you the option of a second meeting. So you now have all day, which is a window of 5 or 6 hours.
Right, so the venue that you paid for in George Street, that gave you the opportunity for the first meeting, and then you would have been able to go into that room in Westminster for a continuation, effectively.
Yeah, it turned out to be turned out to be a blessing, because in Parliament you're not allowed to film. So that would have been closed doors. We'd have been trusting the MPs to hold each other to account on what was said in there. By them cancelling that and us having the room in George Street, we were informed you can film everything here. And so we then invited the press and said, we're going to have a press conference. You'll be able to come and hear the families, interview them, and you'll be able to speak to all the MPs and ministers that come to sort this problem.
Right, so this sounds brilliant. It's all going well. And the media turned up. Sky turned up, and they did a pretty comprehensive recording, to the extent that I think you told me the lady journalist was in tears at one point.
Yeah, they'd filmed throughout the day. So they did the first interview with a family, I think live earlier in the day, and then they'd put out pieces through the day. And I had emailed 80 of the MPs and ministers the night before to say, hey, some of you we've not had a response from, but Sky TV and ITV are going to be there, and the national media will want to know that our MPs and ministers have concern for children losing their lives. For some MPs who we'd not had responses from to 6 or 7 letters raising this issue over the course of a year and a half, suddenly we got our first responses within hours of saying Sky TV and ITV are going to be there. So those emails were coming in on the morning of the meeting, even during the meeting and after the meeting, from cabinet ministers, from the Department for Education as a whole for the first time, from Gavin Williamson. We got our first response in over a year.
Right. So MPs who could not be bothered or would not be bothered to get involved when children are being seriously physically harmed to the extent they may commit suicide, all of a sudden, when they know that they could be in the media spotlight, the MPs start to respond. And that's pretty sickening. We're now getting this pattern, aren't we, that children abused in care, we could go into some of the wider sexual abuse, but in this case, this is bullying in school that you're talking about. But we see the same pattern, that the MPs come up with the excuses as to why they can't get involved, of which a very common one is, oh, well, I can't possibly get involved because you're not in my constituency. Yeah, and that was used, I believe, by the deputy.
That was original, and what's interesting about that is that was at the original start when I wrote to every MP and said, I've got confirmation in writing that there's faults in the system which affects every child in the country, therefore it directly affects you. And it was, you're not in our constituency, we can't deal with it. Now that's a convention, it's not a law. Yeah. And the question you have to ask is, it can't be a law, because what happens if I were to ring every MP in the country and say, somebody's going to assault you outside your office at 5 o'clock? Would they say, we can't deal with that because you're not from our... There's certain issues that you just have to pick up.
Jason, I can say, because we know, because we've in a store just at the back of us here, we've got documents where many years ago we asked about this question, this excuse that MPs give, that you can tell them of a criminal activity and they say, oh, I can't get involved because it's a convention, you're not in my... all it is a gentleman's agreement. It has no standing at law whatsoever. It gives the MPs no protection at all if they were told about a crime, particularly a crime involving children, and they didn't do anything, they are culpable. But they continue to hide behind it, I think, because they continue to believe that it is law, but it's not law, it's just a gentleman's agreement. So I can answer that question for you.
And what I'll say is that suddenly changed. There was no difference apart from the families got involved. Right. So it went from, we can't get involved with you, to they come into Parliament, we can't make this meeting. So if that was consistent, they would have said at Parliament, I can't get involved in this meeting because you're not my constituent. But it was, I now can't get involved because October I'm not available. And again, February I'm not available. So you're giving all these options. And like I say, I think the most concerning thing against it all was whether you can get involved or not, there should be a question at the end of this. You've just told me, you've sent me documents and assault records, children are losing their lives. Can I have a little bit more information? Can I help in some other way? But it wasn't. It was literally kind of one word, one line answers. I'm busy, I can't make it. We had a lot of good looks. I know it's a small thing, But when you're having a meeting to talk about children losing their lives and you want a solution, it's not an event that you need wishing good luck on.
No, that's not an appropriate term. To me, this is the arrogance. My feeling on our MPs at the moment, I classify them as CIA, and by that, the majority of them are complete cowards. They won't stand up on any particular subject. They are scared of their own shadows. They're scared of their party. They're ignorant. Because they don't bother to do any research themselves. They leave it to their researchers. Well, they used to, but now they use the House of Commons library, and they simply get the party line back as an answer to any particular question. So they're cowards, they're ignorant, and the other one is they're unbelievably arrogant. And that is the combination that means we have 650 MPs that when the evidence goes on the table of children suffering abuse in schools, bullying, which results in a tragic number of them committing suicide, our MPs, nothing to do with me.
One thing I'd like to say is one thing that was said was, and this was to families, there were a number of families that were told by MPs, there's violence and bullying in schools, but not in my constituency.
Oh, really?
And this was an aunt who'd lost her 9-year-old nephew to suicide, and she said, "Well, he's from your constituency." Oh, you've got a point. And I have this from a lot of people. I've taught, I work in schools. It doesn't happen in my schools. Thankfully, situations like this are really rare. And the question you ask is, how do you know it's rare if it's not recorded?
Right, and this has been a key point from you all the way through, that if you start to ask the simple questions about the statistics of bullying in schools, and even if you ask the question about suicides, nobody has got those statistics. Now, one of the media people, I think I remember correctly, did actually put in a freedom of information request to get the number of suicides. Is that correct?
Yeah, can I mention the station? Is that all?
Well, I think so, of course.
Yep, so LBC had started an investigation and had put in a freedom of information request to find out how many suicides there were of school children. Because when you think about the statistics we have at the moment, in terms of trying to deal with the issue that we have in this country with coronavirus, we have statistics for whether you've gone for a walk in the park, whether you've got a cold, whether you've tested positive, and yet we have a country who couldn't tell you how many children have been bullied to death in this country. Yeah. And those statistics aren't available. So to me, that just.
And we're not sure about how many children commit suicide, even though we're apparently got this massive countrywide mental health campaign. I found that astonishing. So strangely enough, we're back on the subject of the safety of children.
Yeah.
And the state says we have this wonderful regime in place to protect children. But when you look at what's actually happening and the children are being injured and hurt and commit suicide, then all of a sudden we discover actually there's no proper records in the first place. And even with that situation, the state doesn't care. If it cared, those MPs would turn up.
And one thing I'd say is, if this was just my opinion or your opinion, Brian, you'd say, okay, we need to look at that. But as I say, it's been supported by so many people. But the UN have a project and they say they want to end violence in schools across the world by 2024. One of the main criticisms they have of the system is the lack of data in countries. And they say that governments are not prioritising this issue and they're not recording data. And because of that, you can't solve the problem because you can't form policy when you have no idea the extent of the problem in your country. And I think when we look at that, we're looking at, other countries and we're looking at others all the time. But when you're looking at the UN saying, to fix this and end it by 2024, we need to start recording. And then we're going through this fight for 30 years at least. MPs and ministers are saying we should be recording, but we're not going to. And you've got to ask the question, why is that?
Yeah. Is it that they're happy with the situation? They're happy with the situation that children are being abused because actually they don't care for those children at all. Now, I think we've got about 8 minutes to go, something like that. The responses from the media, you dealt with newspapers, so you dealt with the Sunday Times, you were talking to the Guardian, you were talking to these mainstream TV channels, you were talking to the BBC. You got a very mixed package of responses. I think we've got to give credit to Sky. At least they sent a team to your London meeting.
And ITV came to the London meeting.
And ITV did as well, that's correct. But out of the newspapers, a bit of a mixed response. We'll come on to that. What about the BBC? How did the BBC treat you?
They've changed my perception of the BBC, because in told that was the main safeguard I felt would be in place in terms of the media. So they were who I went to first, and probably where I invested most of my energy. And you're probably talking 6 or 7 journalists, and within the education department as well, that have been involved in having the evidence presented to them and accepting that evidence and saying, this is, and as we'll see from some of the clips that you put up, this is a story that we're interested in, this is a serious issue, and then that basically going cold. So this was a pattern with all journalists, so not just the BBC, that people would say, you're telling the truth, you've got the facts, this is a serious story, we're going to run it, we're going to look at it, then going off and me kind of following up and saying, hey, you've suddenly not got back to me, and then just not getting a response.
Right.
So somehow it's going up this and getting stuck in this bottleneck, and it's not going to the top, and it's not going any further than an enthusiastic journalist saying something has to be done.
And you've also picked up, certainly we've experienced this, that actually you can connect with a journalist who seems keen. They look at it and they're clearly excited in a journalistic sense about what they see. But the next thing is the story goes cold. It's as though the editorial team has clamped down on it.
Yeah.
Right. So just very quickly, we've got some documents here. This one is a conversation with the Sunday Times. You were dealing with them quite happily. And the reply here is, thanks for this, Jason. Is this exclusive to the Sunday Times, please? So I suppose we have to accept this, that we've got a newspaper that's interested in the story, but maybe they're only really interested if they can have it as an exclusive. Is that a bit unfair, or do you think they would have taken it? Well, they didn't take it.
Again, I would say my interactions, if you go right through the emails, are good with the journalists. So there seems to be that enthusiasm, and I would honestly say, hand on heart, that it's coming from somewhere else, because these stories and these journalists I'm targeting because they've got involved in these tricky issues before. So I've noticed this journalist has a passion for this and they're speaking out. So that's been the reaction I've had initially, and it's definitely a block for me that's coming from somewhere else. And just if I can very quickly go back to you asking if the MPs care, I think they care to an extent, but the issue is so bad they realise what they're going to.
It's a tar baby. They don't want to touch it.
They realise they're going to expose. So I would think even the most caring of MPs is looking at this and saying, this is a mess. I've got to be honest, Brian, you're talking about the cover-up of children's deaths potentially, misconduct, these are criminal allegations. And so I don't know if these MPs have the power to take this forward unless we as the British public hold them to account, and that's what the campaign
I think
is all about.
That's a really powerful statement. It's holding them to account, it's encouraging them and supporting them when they do the right things, and it's absolutely holding their feet to the fire when they're clearly not doing the right things.
Can I contradict you, Brian? And I'm going to say it on your last one.
Yeah.
Like, I think they're a good, I'm believing they're good apples in Parliament, so this is my appeal to them, that out of 650 MPs, there are those that know we should be recording and want to do the right thing. And in challenging you to come forward, we will find out who are the bad apples, who are the ones who are willing to, being blunt, have children lose their lives and allow that to continue for another 30 years, and who are the ones who are going to say enough is enough.
Yeah. Okay. BBC here on screen. This is a pretty classic BBC reply. Hi, Jason. Sorry to be slow in replying, and thanks for sending the information. I was waiting to see if I'd have a chance to pursue, but I've got another couple of stories that I've got to get through. I thought it was better to get back to you, as I know it's annoying when you send something and don't get a reply. But to be completely honest, I'm not going to have time to dig into this, and suspect this would take some serious attention, so don't want to keep you waiting. We're talking about the deaths of children. And, well, I don't really have the time to dig into this. I can't really come back to you. But this morning in Plymouth, we're sharing a platform by the seaside with the BBC that has sent a whole media van and a wonderful BBC lady, a head of department, to report on a particularly horrible metal statue. It's outrageous, the hypocrisy in what's going on here. The BBC cannot investigate the abuse of children, but we can report on statues. I'll leave it there. What's this one here? We've got another BBC one. Hi, Jason. I should arrive at Leeds train station a little before 4:30. Is that still suitable for you? Hope to see you then. Now, this was early days, I think I'm right in saying, was it, where they showed some interest?
Yeah, this was Panorama, and the journalist had been very good. And again, I'm going to say it got stopped for it because that journalist put so much effort into, and when you spend time with someone, she visited twice in my city, and you could see the compassion and the concern, and she gave 100%, and suddenly it just seemed to get stopped. There was one point I had to pull away because, for me, not having the trust in the BBC because it went on so long, because I'm feeling if children's lives are in danger, it's got to be an urgent matter, and for that to get putting back because of schedules and other stories. So I just felt that, you know, and it's how I feel now. Can I trust the most valuable thing in the world, which is these families' children's legacies, with the BBC? You know, will they tell the true story now? Will it be a case of we look bad and now we're going to tell a story that contrasts with what the families are saying to say to the British public, hey, they got it wrong?
Now there was a clip from BBC North, is that the correct, or BBC Yorkshire?
It would have been BBC Midlands did the original story, and I was filmed with BBC Yorkshire.
I got there, BBC Midlands. And I will make sure that little clip goes into this report, but essentially you'd picked up on the fact that you'd gone to them with the story of vicious bullying in schools, which in some cases was resulting in suicide, and the BBC appeared to spin the story to converting it into a story about concerns about mental health.
Yeah, when that story in the clip that the viewers will see is edited, and it's had to have the text, so an explanation of our campaign added, because essentially the footage without my explanation doesn't tell you anything about violence in schools, anything about bullying. It essentially says it's a mental health issue. Now, it might not seem like a lot of difference, but our case and our campaign is violence in schools is something that can be stopped. It's not an accident. Somebody is at fault. Mental health is nobody's at fault. It's a problem with the children or the families. So for me, I felt I wasn't sure it was an accident. It's conflated from, it's spun from schools not being able to control violence, to covering it up, to it leading to a child's death, to a story of child's got problems in their mind, and that's led to their death. Now we'll actually, for viewers who are going to be watching this, we'll put the clip up now and you can watch that clip. And we've said, well, we've described it before you see the clip. So I think it's very, very powerful because it's very obvious what's going on, and you've put up the explanation.
There's no doubt that organisations such as Childline have significantly changed things for children, giving them a voice. But there are still youngsters who take their own lives. In a moment, we'll be hearing from the man heading up a campaign aimed at stopping that happening. But first, Liz Copper went to speak to the aunt of Aaron Dugmore, who died at just 9 years old.
He was lovely, so kind-hearted, always caring about others. He's just so sweet. We'll always question that. Why?
Aaron Dugmore was 9 years old when he took his own life. 6 years on, and his family's grief is raw.
Christmas, birthdays, never been the same. Never. Just in general, certain days I'd be thinking I was here this time 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and what we were doing together, and he should be still here now.
Aaron's aunt is training as a parent ambassador, working with schools in Sutton Coldfield to help other families. She's joining forces with parents from across the UK to press for greater awareness of the risks to children's mental health.
I mean, Aaron would want this to help other people. I know I don't want his life taken for no reason whatsoever. So if we can make a success of other people and children, then I'm with it 100%.
The hope is the campaign group will lead to greater understanding, and Aaron's legacy will be to help other children and their families. Liz Copper, BBC Midlands Today, Sutton Coldfield.
Well, Donna's going to be at a meeting in Leeds this evening, which will be attended by families from all over the country. Earlier today, I spoke to the organiser, Jason Barnett, who explained what would be happening.
It's about the parents coming together to tell their stories. Some of those stories are going to be raw. Many of those parents are emotional. Some of those parents are angry. But more importantly, they're passionate about making sure that what their families have been through and what they've been through never has to happen to other families. So it's brave what they're doing tonight. They're bringing a lot of raw emotions up with things they don't want to deal with, but they know how important it is to other people, to young people. It's important to me because of what young people feel, and they need to have a voice. We want to send a message out tonight to say to the kids all over, anyone who's contemplating suicide or thinking that there's no way out and that nobody cares, that there are people fighting for you.
So what would you like to happen?
I would like the government to give children the same protections in their workplace by law as every single adult, every single teacher and every single politician has in the country, so that when they raise a concern, it's taken seriously but by law, and if the person in charge doesn't deal with it, then it's a criminal offence.
Jason Barnett, thank you.
Now, we've got the media mixed response. The Guardian you'd also approached and they showed some interest but didn't subsequently report.
Yep, they'd asked if I wanted it to be anonymous, and I said no, it was about being a voice, and unless you're open and honest, then the public may not trust the information. So I was quite happy to be public. He said it would probably need a meeting. You know, it was important enough to need a meeting. Sent through some more information, didn't get response, sent a follow-up to say, hey, you're still interested in the story, and again, had nothing since. So again, it seems it's hitting this bottleneck. People are really interested in the story to the point of wanting a meeting, and then nothing happens.
And this, to me, suggests a clampdown by the editorial board. And we do get some feedback from journalists who are friendly to the UK column that this thing happens. They have good stories, they want to do it, but the editorial board has somehow been leaned on and they close the story down. Now, what about charities? Because we've got this one here. This is a charity, I believe it's one of the biggest anti-bullying charities for schools, and you approached them, but they didn't want to get involved. I'll just read this one out. It says, Dear Jason, many thanks for the email and taking time to contact us about this. We work predominantly in schools providing anti-bullying ambassador training to support young people through peer-to-peer support. We're a small charity and are unable to take this up at this time. I find this absolutely remarkable because it's got a Diana Award, so whatever they say about themselves, they're a very high-profile charity. You are talking about coming to them with ready packaged evidence as to what's going on in schools, and their reply is, sorry, we don't have time to deal with this. It's a fob off.
Yeah.
And what's this one here? So we're back on BBC, but yes, well, I missed it first time round because Panorama even showed a bit of interest in dealing with this.
The initial one we talked about before was Panorama, but this was another journalist from the Education Department who had looked into the story. Two were from the Education Department, were looking into the story, and again they were looking at the connections. Had it already been investigated? Had the story already been covered? So it was, like I say, it was constant backwards and forwards with the journalists. over the years, and it was a case of me trying to I shouldn't have been having to do this, but strategically get this story to them. So when you have a story, normally you'd be saying, okay, I've got to give them enough so that I had to hold back on evidence. So there were instances where I couldn't tell them about the assaults, about the hostage situations, because it was scaring journalists. So eventually, when you talk about Sky TV, it was a very gentle reaching out to journalists and asking some journalists who were helpful, what do I need to do to get someone to grasp this story? And it was break it down, give them a small chunk.
Jason, isn't this incredible that this is your description of the media inside UK, but overseas we've got the media scrabbling to get at the coalface, to film the bodies, to report on what they believe is a chemical attack. They are desperate to get to the most gruesome part of the story possible to feed it back to the British audience. But when we're in Britain and we're talking about what's really happening to the children and they are dying, all of a sudden you've got to treat the media carefully because it might offend them. It's bizarre. Or it's contrived, and I think it's contrived. This section you're going to have to give me some help with, but I think is a paragraph from a letter that you wrote to Gavin Williamson.
No, so this one, let's just have a look.
Oh, this was oh right, sorry, this was the BBC. So I beg your pardon on this. This was the BBC one, where the BBC was saying they thought it might move forward.
Yeah. So I know where we are. So after Parliament, again, Sky had been at Parliament. They weren't allowed to film in there, neither ITV. So essentially, they had broadcast to the nation.
Right.
These families have come forward with policies that could protect children across the UK. Yeah. They're going to go into Parliament, discuss it with the ministers and MPs, and hopefully the nation will find out the problem has been solved. So my then feedback to the journalists the day after was, how did it go? Yeah. What was the MP's response? And it was, we didn't get one because only the one showed up. There were two, sort of one came earlier and missed us. So obviously the follow-up story is none of these MPs turned up. At that point, we didn't get a follow-up. We then ran a petition and they said, we'll follow the petition. We'll look to do a follow-up. It wasn't long after that COVID hit, probably maybe 2-3 weeks after that, we started going into lockdown. So they then said, at this point, this is hitting the news story. And then consistently, I was reaching out to them. Every time I saw a gap and kids are going back to school, I can see they're doing stories on school. Hey, what about this one? And then we weren't getting the reach. And the BBC had said to them, okay, you missed the opportunity to be at Parliament, mix up with emails or however it went, but here's an opportunity now to follow up. I think I talked maybe about the investigation with Gavin Williamson, but it was basically an appeal to say, as a nation's broadcaster, this is your job.
Right, okay. And I particularly wanted to show this one. We're just getting to the end now, but this was a reply from Gavin Williamson, where essentially the opening part of the letter is all concern, isn't it? He's saying, officials from my department have been reviewing the correspondence that you addressed to me, Damien Hines and Nick Gibb MPs at our respective parliamentary email addresses concerning your Safer Schools campaign.
Yeah, for that, it was confirmation that you've had these letters, you've now been through everything, you've got all the evidence. What are you going to do with these allegations about misconduct and criminal malfeasance potentially?
Right, and then his second paragraph there, I'm always saddened to hear about bullying, serious harm, attempted suicide and loss of life, especially amongst school children, and I recognise the devastation it has on families. All children deserve a safe environment in which they can learn. Children who need help and protection deserve high quality and effective support as soon as need is identified. I declined your kind invitation to attend your Safer Schools meeting on the 21st of February due to heavy diary pressures. And from then on, when he says turning to your concerns about the safety of school children, he simply prints in his letter what the supposed system is for protecting them. So this is what we say we do here, this is what we say we do here, and your answer to that is, well, that's great because we are showing that none of these protective systems work.
Yeah, essentially what his whole case was these are our policies.
Yeah.
We give schools freedom to do what they want, and our case is you've allowed schools to do what they want for 30 years and it's allowed them to cover up deaths. This is what you need to change, and he's essentially everything's fine because schools are in charge of themselves.
Right. In contrast to responses that you had from UK, you had responses from people you wrote to overseas, and I think this one's the Czech Republic. So you wrote to the Czech Republic talking about your concerns for school children in the UK, and they even bothered to reply to you, and this one has got a wet signature. A human being has signed this letter.
Yeah, so just on that story, because it probably throws the viewers off, but in 2017, when I'm getting no response from my Prime Minister, you know, in my heart, I'm feeling conversation with God of, does nobody care about the children? I'm like, around the world, there must be somebody. And I just had this notion that who's responsible for every child in the world, and it's the leaders of every country. So very simply, I made a commitment to write to every leader in every single country. I think there was 198 emails I sent out, not expecting any replies, but I probably got 9 replies back. One was a 3-page letter from Chile. So you consider I've ended up with more responses back from 200 world leaders than I got from 650 MPs. And again, many of them were expressing concern about the children. Some were describing how they look after their children, their concerns for the children. So it wasn't essentially a letter saying, this is the ins and outs of the campaign. It was basically, we're a campaign, we're trying to make children safer in the UK. We have some issues. How do you know, what are your concerns about children in your country? And I asked those world leaders to pray for our children in the UK, to keep an eye on the campaign and to keep an eye essentially on our leaders.
Jason, I started out by saying you've done an incredible job. What you've done, really tremendous, and the passion that you put into it is tremendous. I don't know how you've done it. There's a little video clip here which was taken after the Westminster meeting, where you were giving us summing up to camera. So we're going to put that on screen now for people to watch and listen. But I think you gave the best summing up, the best. So why replicate it here? Let's watch that little video clip.
So we've come to London today with the families from the Safer Schools campaign group, and even though it's been a tiring and exhausting day for all the families and myself, from our point of view, I don't think things could have gone much better in terms of us getting our story out there. We've been on Sky Live, we've been on ITV, and the story has been told, which has been the most important thing. It's about getting everybody involved in the campaign now. We know there are hundreds and thousands of families out there, hundreds and thousands of children who've been affected by bullying, who suffer daily in schools, who need their stories told. So the group is here for them. Fight for the Fatherless in Action is the campaign page, which you can follow the Safer Schools campaign on. And we essentially need to follow what Sky has done, what the BBC has done, and ITV has done, and get the campaign out there. In terms of Parliament itself, the building behind us, and 1 George Street, we sent invites out to 650 MPs, and the fear of the families was that they didn't want to tackle this issue. We had always said that perhaps they wouldn't come to that meeting. They didn't want to deal with such a difficult and a tragic issue. We had 1 MP turn up today out of 650 invites. We must have maybe 70, 80 replies that have said they can't come to the meeting, no real reason, no condolences offered. So that's where we stand now. The campaign is going forward, the story is being told. Our families won't give up, we can't afford to give up. There are children all over the UK depending on this campaign, depending on the families to keep speaking out. So we'll continue to do that, we'll continue to fight. Thanks for following our journey, continue to support us. It's not just about us as a group, it's about everybody out there across the UK doing their best to fight for the children.
On that point, and I think I'm going to probably ask everyone this, we'd already spoke about this beforehand, but how do you feel about the fact that they're over the road, maybe 200 yards away, there are 650 people charged by this country to take care of the citizens? That is their job.
Disgusted.
And they've not come to see if they can...
I feel disgusted, and I feel actually quite sick that they don't care. I mean, children, there's vulnerable children as well, and it's more so the vulnerable children that are mainly like, say, got special needs, or they stand out because they're different. They'll get picked on, they're a target within school.
How do you feel about the fact that they're not here today?
Well, it speaks volumes, doesn't it? Our local MP, or at least the MP that covers the area where the school is, hasn't even acknowledged Bradley's death. Couldn't even send condolences. Parents of other pupils in the school spoke to her, and she just wanted to brush it to one side. Our Secretary of State for Wales was invited by yourself.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've had an acknowledgement. I haven't.
Possibly not.
No. Says it all. It's not their kids, not their problem.
Very sad that you had to make that report to camera, but you have started something. You've made an approach to UK Column saying, would we put out a broadcast with you? I'm going to say, Jason, I'm going to shake your hand because I'm delighted to have you here in the studio. And I've been just amazed at the knowledge, accuracy of the reports and the evidence. And in working with you today to prepare what we've done, it's clear to me we can't really get everything in this story in one go. So I'd like to make this commitment live that I would like to work with you more on this to see how we can follow through, how we can put more evidence out. But also I'm going to say to UK Column viewers, if you've been impressed by what you've heard here, and you are obviously concerned about what's happening to the children, we're going to need your help to hold these people to account. You've heard and seen who they are. We know some of the tactics. And basically, if we're to do something about it, we've got to get a response out of these MPs to stop the unnecessary deaths of children. And the last thing I just wish to say, Jason, as he followed through this, started to realise fairly late in the day that actually some very dirty sniping had started behind your back. And so it was obvious that within the Westminster circles, fingers were being pointed saying to parents, oh, you don't really want to get involved in this gentleman because he's really running his own campaign. So you've stood up to be counted, you've lost your job, you've put all the evidence on the table as to what's been happening with the children, you've brought the families together, and the best that Westminster, Britain's Westminster can do, and the state establishment, is to try and accuse you of being some grabber using these parents in their time of trauma. I think that's pretty despicable. I'll give you a reply to that if you want to come back on that one.
It's a question I've been asked a lot, that why would you sacrifice for the children in this way? As a Christian, I have a hero. My hero is Jesus, and it's I call it the greatest love story ever, that he would sacrifice his life for others. And I kind of say, hey, wouldn't it be great for the kids now to hear a story like that, but in 2020? And so it's about, if I can lay my life down so that other children have their life and they can live better and they're safer, then that's something to strive for. And being a world champion is great, but being the best natural bodybuilder is one thing. To be the best father figure to children that you don't even know is something entirely different. So I'm driven by my purpose. I'm driven by my faith. I know everybody out there is looking to be a hero in some way, especially in this difficult time. And I guarantee you, all across this country, there are children that need a superhero. So I'm asking the British public to stand up and be counted. Our campaign is called Fight for the Fatherless, not because it's just about the fatherless, but because it's about every child who needs every man, every mother, everyone in society to stand up and be family for them, for every child that's in care to be family for them. We feel that recording data, recording these issues is the key to so many issues being broken over. For everybody who's fighting child trafficking at the moment, you know, I salute you with standing up and want to save our children. But think about this, if they're recording data in schools and that becomes law, how many other incidents are they going to record? So if a child talks about being violently assaulted in school and they have confidence that that's got to be recorded, are they going to reveal what happened at the weekend? So we're going to learn about all these issues, and the key is, you've heard this story, you've heard how this is so easily covered and how the deaths of children can be covered. Then you have to ask, is this the same pattern that's happening everywhere else? I'll just say John Wedger has spoken on this programme before about care homes. We're talking at the moment across the nation about the thousands of children that go missing every year. I think they said 90% of those are going missing from care homes. Now, if those care homes aren't recording those issues and incidents, how can we solve that problem? And we talk about, you know, I've worked in care homes, and just one thing I want to say is, one of the issues with child trafficking, which I think is a problem, is firstly the recording. But I worked in a children's home where on the Fridays, John Wedger has said, I'd arrive on the Friday and the kids would be getting ready to go out, and I'd say, where are they going? They're 13. They're going out, and what time do they have to be in? They'll come back Monday, Tuesday. And I'm like, you can't allow that. You know where they're going. And they'd say, we're not allowed to stop them because of their human rights by law. And the question is why do we have a government who knows that thousands of children are going missing, losing their lives, and they say we can't stop them and prevent them from being harmed because they can now say to adults, for your good and for your safety, we're going to lock you down.
We're going to lock you down. We'll end there. Jason, thank you very, very much for joining me. Very powerful interview. We'll leave it there.